other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
So here's a statement that really shouldn't be controversial, but somehow is. Collaborative Transformers are garbage. I'm not talking about crossover figures in general, plenty of such in the past have done quite well. No, I'm referring to the specific line referred to as Transformers Collaborative. The Hasbro initiative that seemed to have potential but shit itself right out the door. Out of a lineup of 9 currently released figures, which excludes the re-releases and redecos as tempting as it is to include them, only 4 of them have actually turned out any good. And guess which ones haven't been reissued? I've already covered the issues surrounding this line extensively, because Hasbro doesn't have to try, they don't really bother doing such. Twice now I've sworn myself off these crossover figures. I only broke this trend because Amazon mispriced the Jurassic Park set, and as bad as the Jeep is, I was basically getting him for free. Predictably though, something always catches my eye. There's always that one figure that makes me second guess myself. Have they finally learned their lesson? Have they finally met the bare minimum that your average deluxe follows? Are things looking up? Have you seen the thumbnail for this video? Well, there's your answer, but to elaborate, greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to collaborative 2022 G.I. Joe Megatron. You know, honestly, I'm surprised it's taken this ruddy long to get any transforming versions of the Hiss Tank. Numerous factors have put the possibility on the edge, but none have ever quite pushed it into reality. G.I. Joe and Transformers had a lot of fan-based crossover back in the 80s, so you'd think you'd see more cameos beyond Old Snake, but apparently not. A while afterwards, and by a while I mean a decade or so, we were graced with non-transforming homages that pissed off Harmony Gold into a lawsuit, which they failed miserably at and can never sue Hasbro over again. Funny how Hasbro doesn't really care about homages when the shoe is on the other foot, although I guess they've always ignored third party anyway, and during and since that debacle there's been numerous G.I. Joe Transformers throughout the years, including official travesties of Plastic Addict fame, pieces from the early years of third party that have probably crumbled into dust by now, and a billion TFC repaints keeping their company on life support after people stopped caring about their combiners. There was even supposed to be a third-party Soundwave Hiss Tank on the horizon, although something tells me this isn't actually ever getting released. It was only a matter of time, however, and several decades later we finally have a black cheese wedge on treads that transforms into a giant robot. Be it unfortunate that it has to compete with the HasLab version, but oh well, Hasbro's concern, not mine. Now, although this review will eventually descend into madness, there are things I can praise with the figure, especially with the vehicle mode. I wouldn't necessarily call the Hiss Tank iconic per se, at least not to those who aren't familiar with G.I. Joe, but I will say it's unmistakable. Collaborative figures have always put a lot of effort into their vehicle modes, and Megatron is no exception. It's sort of pulling the Black Convoy effect, because technically everything looks better in black, but as a vehicle, this is damn sexy. The top section is clean, working in its seam lines very well. Extremely commendable given the robot mode essentially wears its kibble like a cosplayer who discovered 3D printing for the first time. Despite having to practically fold inside out, the cockpit section isn't messy at all. I really appreciate that they've gone to the trouble of sculpting the seating area. Yes, it's in service of the gimmick, but it's still rad either way. Can't say I'm a fan of the unpigmented clear windshield. The renders showed an intention to have it slightly tinted, putting it in line with most of the Hiss tanks on the market, at least according to Google Images. Still, hardly something to get too angry over, especially when they've got some rad tampagraphs on the side. These look sick, and I've got to give extra props considering these are red on black plastic. Usually this would be a recipe for disaster, but they've been done really crisply and clearly. Pretty substantial step up from the last time we took a look at collaborative tampagraphs. It does bring up an annoying budgeting decision though. This alt mode basically has no paint. With the exception of the color correction on the windshield hinge and the leftover exposed robo bits, all the color breakup has been achieved through different forms of tampagraphs. Cobra logos, model numbers, random Easter eggs that'll get G.I. Joe fans splooging over the screen but fall completely flat on yours truly. They've spared no expense on these with a grand total of 13 applications. Under normal circumstances, this would be a pretty grave oversight, and in some of the pack-in instances it actually is. But as far as the vehicle mode is concerned, this weirdly works. Like, you don't feel like you're missing out on anything, save for the out-of-place windshields. Take the light section at the front, for instance. Would it be cooler if these were molded and painted? Absolutely, but again, these are done really well, almost giving an Empire vibe. The entire package doesn't feel like the lack of paint here ruins everything. Well, at least in this mode anyway. Sure, I would have much preferred paint on the tread sections on the side, but the amount of sculpted detail more than makes up for it. The gears towards the front could be a little deeper, but given the way the ankle supports fold out, I understand why they're pretty flat. Everything behind it looks great anyway. As Magic Square Motormaster's review should have shown you, I'm a sucker for rivets. The treads also do a good job hiding Megatron's kibble. You get the feet towards the front, and at the back, the chest just kinda chills there. But honestly, I don't find them that egregious. This is a weird as f*** alt mode, and the transformation goes through some pretty crazy shit. It's a fairly negligible sacrifice, and I've seen way worse exposed robot bits on Transformers this year. And to finish off the last couple of details, I really appreciate they've gone to the extra trouble of molding in the grate section at the bottom, or whatever it's supposed to be called. Perhaps some of y'all can clarify in the comments. Granted, this piece causes a pretty hefty issue later on, but hey, it's a subtle detail I appreciate them having. And at the top, the turret section is neat. I really like how the whole seating section moves when you rotate it, as opposed to just being the ring at the top. It's a nifty feature that adds to the team-up playability. And sure, the guns are a little cheap, but hey, blast effects compatibility. Always awesome to see. Now, you can add the fusion cannon on the top here, but this really looks ridiculous. Don't know if I can even give it an A+ for effort, because this doesn't seem to show any effort at all. That said, I'm pretty sure this weapon storage hook is intentional. Well, half sure. Okay, I'm not really sure at all, but it seems to work alright. Do kinda wish there was some better storage inside the hollow underside, something a bit more purposeful, but hey, as Emgo would say, it's a thing you can do if you want to. So yeah, there's not much I can really fault with in terms of the vehicle mode. Sure, this is par for the course with collaborative figures, but if something is done well, I'm going to point out that it was done well, and the Hiss Tank certainly is. Full disclosure, I don't have a point of reference as I'm not well versed in G.I. Joe lore. Part of the charm may be from the fact that this is a pretty unique vehicle, and I'm just taking that uniqueness as a form of charm. For all I know, this is a bastardization of the classic design, kinda like how Thunderbirds Go massacred Thunderbird 5. Never forgive, never forget. That said, in my own unprofessional opinion, this is an expertly crafted vehicle mode. Would I have preferred a greater emphasis on paint over tamper graphs? Absolutely, but for what we have, it's neat. I can look at this mode and tell it was crafted with care. Something I cannot say for the included companion figure. So this is Baroness, and I'm sorry, this is the most half-assed pack-in I've seen in a very long time, and believe me, that's saying something. I've stared into the dark soul the size of DNA design wheelie. I've seen shit, and yet this somehow feels worse. I'll give you this, at least the sculpting is pretty nice. Once again, you can tell this is where the designers really went to town. One small problem though, no paint. At all. Because of this, a lot of the detail ends up getting lost. And to an extent, I get it. Many depictions of the design are supposed to be completely in black. Thing is, that doesn't necessarily translate to toy form. Accuracy isn't a positive or a negative, it's simply an aesthetic choice. Sometimes it's to the benefit of a figure, others it's to the detriment. I mean, for f***'s sake, even the box art has grey highlights on it. Legit, your average Micromaster, War for Cybertron or G1 is painted better than this shit. Hell, I'm pretty sure I've seen regular release Hasbro Titan Masters with better paint. Actually, wait a second, I'm not being entirely truthful here. Allow me to correct myself. While the paint is indeed severely lacking, there is a little bit on the face, and oh boy is it sloppy. Glasses on a figure are always difficult to do, so I do feel for the deco designers, but Christ, this has to be one of the worst attempts I've seen. The whole thing is painted in black, and then the skin tone is painted over the top. So much mismatch, and the skin tone bleeds like crazy. Doesn't help that the face sculpt looks real bad to begin with. Baroness, the local librarian. Baroness, Hillary Clinton in glasses. I'm not even a G.I. Joe fan, and even I know this is bad. By far the worst part is the articulation, though. At first glance, it seems fine enough, missing a thigh swivel, but ah well. For a pack-in accessory, it's not too big of a deal, right? 3 problems, though. 1. The torso is held together using a metal hook and a rubber band. This is horrible for waist longevity. Much like Ectotron sealing the rubber parts in paint, so they couldn't be treated and maintained, this is going to break down over time, leaving poor old Baroness in I Want 2 configuration. I seriously hope the other modern 3 3/4 figures don't use the same waist system, because if they do, it's a grave oversight. We have the technology, use it! Secondly, no head articulation. It's supposed to be in there, but the hair prevents it from fully functioning. On a tiny Micromaster or included partner, I get it, but this is attempting to be a fully fledged action figure. They wouldn't have packed it onto its own card otherwise. Plus, on a figure of this size, it's just plain unacceptable. And finally, no wrist swivels. You may be wondering, yo doc, why is that an issue when this thing is only a hair shorter than a Legends figure? Well, dear viewer, normally it wouldn't be. if the wrists weren't rotated at a 45-degree angle, permanently making the included rifle angled slightly to the side. You can't pose her in any action poses. They all look rubbish. Why do this? It literally takes no extra plastic to have the wrists rotated forwards. Is it so the stock doesn't clash with the wrist? Maybe redesign the gun then? For f***'s sake, I should be praising shit like coming with a display base. More action figures should incorporate these, especially given it's often hard to get them to stand. But no, I can't praise it because she doesn't look natural in any pose anyway. Literally, the best thing about this figure is the packaging it comes with. It's essentially a card inside of the main box, designed to look like the original 80s release, and this is pretty nifty. Obviously, it's not going to be of the same cardboard quality as your standard figure you'd find separately on store shelves, and personally I would have preferred the budget go into the actual paint cost of the figure, but hey, it's a neat feature to have. Now, going in without context, all of these issues stem from laziness. However, apparently this figure is very similar to the original version from the 80s, much like the box art it's encased in. Not identical, but trying to do the same thing. Yes, it does it poorly, especially in the face sculpt, but an attempt was made at least. In this lens, a lot of the issues make sense, but I still cannot absolve Baroness of her shittiness. Yay, great job for being accurate to the original shitty design, but hang on a minute, is this a reissue? No! This is a modern-day collector-grade release. You expect a higher level of quality. Accurate or not, the fumbles cause the end result to be worse. I don't see a scenario where they couldn't have made Baroness better. There is no context that makes it impossible here because all the tweaks are fairly minor, despite ruining the figure on the whole. Honestly, if you can make it to the end of this video and for some infernal reason you still want this set, I'd recommend leaving her on the card. Sure, you don't get access to the compatibility features, of which there are several, but the cons far outweigh the pros. And at least in the vehicle mode, you don't really need her. I mean, look at this thing. Why would you want to sully the glorious mechanical duck with this piece of shit? Honestly, in a hypothetical situation where the rest of Megatron was as good as the alt mode, I'd say you could completely ignore this glorified accessory. Unfortunately, we don't live in that hypothetical world though, so we gotta move on and break down some preconceptions. But first, size discussions. Megatron's a beefy motherfucker. If you're paying the Aussie price, you can really see where the budget went. And yes, I deliberately referred to the Australian price, because don't worry, we'll get to that. Anywho, transformation time. First thing we owe. Shit. Congratulations, Cliffjumper! I am pleased to announce today your retirement as the channel's Partsforming punching bag. It's been a long time coming, but you're finally free to go off and see the world. Thank you for your service, and you will be missed. Okay, so I don't need to explain my stance on Partsforming, right? I've just spent almost an hour and 50 minutes on a mini-series that praises a combiner that incorporates heavy use of Partsforming. I am not a hater of Partsforming. I am a hater of lazy Partsforming. This isn't for the purpose of a combiner. This isn't for the purpose of weapon storage. This isn't part of the figure's core identity. This is a piece you yoink off and put to the side because they couldn't be asked figuring out where to put the extra panels. This figure has a really clever conversion scheme. The way the panels fold around is actually quite brilliant, and they had to ruin it with this shit. And like all bad examples, they try to justify this as a shield. Yikes, and I thought the car boot was bad. Yeah, this is definitely worse than the Cliffjumper mold's take on it, because one, without the panel, Megatron's head is just left sitting there, while Cliff's alt mode at least looks like 2/3 of a vehicle, and two, again, this is even worse of a shield. They could have easily had an extra panel fold down and turn this into a riot shield, but no, this is literally a panel of the vehicle that pops off and does nothing else. So yeah, we have a new champion of bullshit. From this point on, I'm not going to use Cliffjumper as the linchpin for my anti-lazy Partsforming argument anymore. The movement has a new face, and one even more egregious. And it's a damn shame too, because this thing has a lot going on under the hood. There are great steps in the transformation, showing that at least the initial designer cared about this thing. It's just that they got lazy at the last second and rendered all of the ideas useless. But well, enough dawdling on that. We have actually good transformation steps to discuss. First thing you want to do is come around to the back and separate that. That will allow you to move the torso up like so. You make sure these bits are out of there, just so you get a bit of clearance. Come around to the front and try to bring out the feet. You might need to waggle a few things around, but yeah, the feet go out like that. Then the legs untab from the bottom and rotate downwards like so. It's actually a pretty clever way of using the tread mass, and I'd like to see it on other Transformers someday. And before you forget, might as well get the ankle supports out like so. Because later you'll be doing other stuff and it might just slip your mind. You can stand him up and he's surprisingly sturdy. Make sure the arms are all the way down like that so that you can start to take this top part off and rotate it upwards and over the back. This will allow you to separate these on these very, very long struts over here, and that will allow you to rotate this whole section up and forward, or up and back I suppose. Come around to the front. These sections rotate down and onto the hip skirts. I really love how these rocket pods work. Using the tread mass to make hip skirt rocket pods, that is such a cool idea. But yeah, these struts use the double hinges to rotate upwards like so. That will allow you to lock in the Megatron chest like that and lock it on the sides with these side pods here. Then you can start rotating the arms into place if you haven't already. Come around to the side like so. This section rotates forward so that you have enough clearance to fold this panel up, and then the whole section folds back again. Really, really clever way of reshaping the mass of the cockpits. Again, there are fantastic steps here in the transformation. It's just ruined by the parts forming. Anyway, once that's done, you just want to come to the back. This just loosely sits here. It's supposed to lock into these tabs here, and it's supposed to be really solid, but it just flat out isn't. We'll get to issues of that later, but last but not least, you want to take this whole section here and rotate it down. It's not just the individual glass piece, it's on this extra housing here. And you rotate the guns around towards the front, and we're done. So yeah, pretty clever transformation that reuses the mass pretty well. A lot of these ideas work great, not just in a vacuum, but in tandem with each other. Again, they're attached to a figure like this with parts forming. Like literally, this just plonks on the wrist on the side there. That's pathetic. Had to go and do it, man. For shame. For shame. The collaborative line has always been cursed with a single warped design ideology. The Automodes are always the high points, even when they have issues themselves, while the robots are usually fumbled together in the last minute. And just when you thought you could get away from the cursed with these newer releases, the falling bowl of petunias comes back to sign annoyance. Oh no, not again. To clarify though, my complaints don't lie with the kibble management. This basically looks like G1 Megatron wearing a bunch of tank kibble on his arms and legs. And you know what? That's fine. It's not an aesthetic that everyone will click with, but I think as far as the aesthetic was handled, it was done pretty well. It sort of reminds me of that recent fan-made OVA that came out, where Megatron wore a bunch of stealth jet kibble and decided to f*** with Starscream. Same principle, basically. The treads stapled to the sides of the legs are mean as f***, and I adore the rocket pods on the side of the hips. Great use of tread mass. The shoulders are also pretty great, and I'd love to see this transformation system used again someday, on a figure that isn't this frustrating. Hell, I don't mind the backpack either. Sure, it is a bit ridiculous, but as far as gimmicks go, this is a pretty unintrusive one. It doesn't affect the articulation in any way, as lacking as said articulation is, and the robot still looks complete with its conclusion. He also doesn't have any issues standing. The tolerances and ankles work in tandem to ensure there are no stability issues. Ultimately, you really have to think of this in the same vein as you would examine a human alliance figure. Things are going to be sacrificed for the minifigure inclusion. Sure, the minifigure included leaves a lot to be desired, but I'm sure you can find something else lying around to make use of. So yeah, my problem doesn't lie with the choice of gimmick or the execution of such. No, my issues lie with everything else surrounding it. The limbs on this design are cool as f***, but they're all surrounding this void of nothingness with the torso. I'm 99% sure the head is a CAD model reuse of the Siege Megatron head, and if it's not, it's taken a lot of inspiration from said design. This is fine and all, that head sculpt was and is awesome. The problem is they've painted the face in this weird grayish whitish shade that makes the whole thing seem like it's the same color. It isn't, and up close you can tell, but from any further distance, medium or far, it just looks like a flat plank of nothing. The torso doesn't help either. It's basically just this flat mush of soft rounded details that end up doing nothing. The G1 torso design is supposed to be a monolithic chunk of crisp wide rectangles, something even clunksters like Magic Square are able to get right. Here though, it's just this vague amalgamation of random shapes. None of these details feel purposeful, and the lack of paint doesn't help either. This is a premium release figure, and it's displaying this massive unpainted grey plank front and center. That's a pretty big oversight, although I'd argue not as big as the gap in the midriff. So the typical midriff is actually a bit higher up, and between that and the actual waist section is a big gaping hole. Jeez, I didn't realize Megatron needed bowel obstruction surgery. I didn't think Transformers had stomachs outside of weird fetish art. The hook doesn't help with the aesthetic much either, reminding me of a previous review subject, although this is nowhere near as bad. Once again, it makes me wish the weapon storage was much better thought out. and also that the weapon was much better thought out. Okay, so the wrist mounting I get. There's all this kibble on the shoulders, so they have to make room. No problems there. But on a $120 figure, did they really have to hollow out the fusion cannon? It's not even hollowness that can be ignored from the front, it can be seen from practically every angle. Maybe this wouldn't have been an issue if they molded this in black instead of grey? I get that mold layouts are expensive and meticulously calculated, but there has to be some leeway on a collector grade item like this. 120 Aussie dollary dues is a lot of money, and you'd expect a certain level of care at that price. Although, keep that cost in the back of your mind for a bit, because we'll get to that towards the end. In the meantime, the fusion cannon ain't the only hollow section here. From the back, practically everything is waffles, and not the good type you'd make at home or get from Max Brenner, the shitty packeted ones you'd find at Aldi. What I mean to say is these hollow sections are vast and open, as opposed to structured and minimalist. Now, admittedly, this fault in a vacuum isn't the worst thing in the world. I've never been someone who's hated hollowness that much. Figures have budgets they have to adhere to, and sometimes filling things in just isn't feasible. Plus, this figure has a pretty crazy transformation, ignoring the blasphemy. While I don't think the hollowness was meant to facilitate such, I can give it a little bit of leeway. It does end up contributing to all the other issues, though, adding to the pile of bullshit that causes this figure to get crushed under the weight of the collaborative team's hubris. But maybe Megatron could lift that weight with some standard articulation, right? Well, at a glance, he seems to have most of the bare essentials. The tolerances all function, and unlike Baroness, he can actually turn his head properly, even with the guns at the back, so there shouldn't be any issues, right? Well, I want you to consider the price tag. I purchased this figure from EB Games for $120, and so far this seems like the median value amongst other prices here in Australia. So, on a figure of this price, where's the waist swivel? Where are the wrists? Where are the ankles? Between this and the kibble getting in the way, not that I dislike kibble, mind you, G.I. Joe is severely limited in his posing power. Aside from a standard lunging pose, there's not a lot he can do. Props to making the ratchet sturdy enough to hold everything up, but it's not enough given the price you're paying for, which again, we'll discuss in more detail. Posing becomes even more frustrating when you take into account the solidity issues. The backpack loves to come undone, which leaves the shoulders loose pretty often. Just, this figure isn't fun to pose, and I reckon it really comes down to the size of the damn thing. Megatron is a big boy. Perhaps too big. We're essentially dealing with a commander-class sized figure at a price tag that's halfway between that and a leader. In terms of raw plastic quantity and engineering, he feels like you're getting what you pay for. But that's the problem. The budget is simply too restricting. He needs more to give him those extra bells and whistles, because without that, he feels severely lacking. That, or he needs to be smaller. This conversion isn't reliant on such a size like a normal commander, so I have to ask, why is he this size? Well, that's simple. It's so Baroness is the same size as the other 3 3/4 G.I. Joe figures. And therein lies the heart of the wicked problem. Baroness likely suffers because there's no budget to make her up to the standard of other action figures, and Megatron definitely suffers because he's underpriced and pushing a size class he has no business being in. Had this figure been 150 or even 160, I guarantee they could have fixed all of these issues. Except, hang on, independent stores are in fact selling this for $160. And wait a minute, let's go over to America for a second. Yes, I know this is primarily an Australian channel, but my audience doesn't really fall into that category.
Oi, get that shit out of here! Who's responsible? That shit makes people less likely to subscribe. Who's responsible? I'm gonna bash that right now.
The standard price in the United States is $89, the same price as a Commander. It's not just one store either, it's the same price across the board. Hell, I've got friends in Canada and Croatia, and it's the same thing. So, the EB Games and JB Hi-Fi prices aren't the actual RRP. Retail is actually the price of a Commander, and those stores are underpricing for whatever reason. Suddenly, the consistent problem that has plagued the entire collaborative line rears its ugly head. Overpricing figures with a lack of effort. From day one, from way back with Ectotron, these figures have charged way more than they're worth. Now, to an extent I get it, the piper must be paid. Licensing fees cost a pretty penny, so obviously these figures aren't going to have much wiggle room to be creative and top of the line with their engineering. It's a sad fact of the business, so yeah, I can vibe with that. Yeah, I can totally vibe with that.
Just one small problem. Sell their licensing fees to who? Aquaman!
G.I. Joe is owned by Hasbro. Transformers is owned by Hasbro. Who the flying is taking a cut from this other than the parasitic executives swimming in Scrooge McDuck money banks? Is it the smaller production numbers that led to this? Then tell me, how does HasLab manage to price things appropriately when Collaborative consistently doesn't? There is virtually no reason for this costing what it does when all the money is being funneled back into Hasbro. Or perhaps we should flip that statement on this head. For what you are actually paying for here, this figure has no business exhibiting the issues it does. The Commander price tag recontextualizes every complaint I've had with this so far. The hollowness, the lack of articulation, even the paintwork in the vehicle mode. And then, on top of that, we have the worst case of lazy parts forming I've covered on this channel. You see what I'm getting at here? And don't tell me it's because Baroness ate up most of the budget. This thing is cheap as shit. This isn't the worst Collaborative figure I've taken a look at, but morally this has to be a low point for the line. The fact they're perfectly fine putting out shits like this at prices like those, come the f*** on. You're being shown up by Lego bricks, and that wasn't even handled by currently working Transformers engineers. So yeah, free from context, this figure may not be the worst thing ever, but you take into account everything surrounding it, yeah, this figure is appalling. Scoring this figure is difficult, because there are things to like here. The vehicle mode is stunning, and the transformation genuinely has a lot of great ideas. It carries the Human Alliance mantle well, and it pains me to see gimmicks executed this well on a figure this bad. In a vacuum, I'd probably give this figure a 2 out of 5, even with the parts forming. But this figure isn't just standing alone, it has other factors to consider. Firstly, Baroness. This figure is meant to unite both Transformers and G.I. Joe fans. This flat out ain't doing that. It ain't pulling its weight, both as a G.I. Joe crossover release and as an action figure in general. Secondly, the price. Maybe you'll find some enjoyment if you can pay the $120 or $110. Maybe if you pop into your local JB Hi-Fi and get it for $100, the numerous flaws can be glossed over. But here's the thing, most people watching this aren't Australian. Anywhere else in the world? Get f***ed, I suppose. But even then, it's not quite enough to push it over the edge. Even then, the positives are still pulling it up by the skin of its teeth. This is where the last flaw comes into play. It's been 3 goddamn years. The problems have been consistent across most of their releases, and Hasbro has had plenty of time to improve. I am not comparing these figures to masterpiece releases in the same price range. I am comparing them to your average deluxe you can find on the shelf on any random day. These releases continuously fail to live up to that $35 standard, which, to be honest, that's pathetic. So yes, I feel the lowest score I can give is appropriate. The team has refused to change their outlook on these releases, committing the bare minimum effort-wise and overcharging for figures that don't have any value beyond its Transformers, but also this popular culture thing I like. They know most customers won't actually care about the quality, only that quick feeling of nostalgia ignited dopamine. A crossover figure can do both. We've seen very recently that it's more than possible, but Hasbro chooses not to. They chose to keep releasing garbage over and over, because why would they do anything else? So once again, I commit to abstaining from the Collaborative line. I'm not getting the Bumblebee. He looks like absolute trash. They're probably going to announce an Optimus Prime in the future, but I'm not pre-ordering it. Maybe I'll take a look at a friend's copy and change my mind, but I'm not taking a leap of faith. I did so with Megatron. I thought maybe they'd learn from their mistakes, but no, they haven't. If anything, they've gotten more blatant. I'm not going to sell this guy off, since it's good to keep a punching bag around to compare and contrast other figures with, but I don't see myself warming up to this figure in any capacity for the near or far future. It's highly likely that I'll eventually fall into Hasbro's trappings again. Later down the line, I'll become complacent and see something that genuinely looks cool. Maybe it'll actually be of standard quality. That probably won't be the case. But until then, until I forsake my stance once more, I'm done. But as always, fan and public consciousness is a conversation, so drop your thoughts on the state of the Collaborative line below. Maybe you feel I'm being too harsh, perhaps there's that extra special figure that tugs at your heartstrings and can do no wrong, or maybe you feel similarly and agree that Hasbro is taking the piss. And as always, there's a context for everything. Till next time.
You love me 伝わるさ君に似合うガラスの